Today I'm going to be showing you my test bench for repairing audio equipment and testing it. It pays to set a few things up neatly on some shelves like this, just so it's all easy to access and nice and simple if you just want to test something out, or if you're working on something and you're doing tests as you're going, or you want to test it when it's finished. Just makes life a lot easier, more efficient obviously, especially if you're going to be doing multiple things. And probably a little bit safer as well, since you are working on potentially dangerous voltages, so you don't want leads and stuff everywhere and equipment everywhere. So basically what I've got set up here is basically similar to a home hi-fi system. We've got an amplifier, a little peak one I fixed before. I put new speaker terminals on that and she's all going. There's a CD player there as well, Sony CD, which I had lying around. And there's a couple of speakers either side of those. They're just a couple of old ceiling speakers that had boxes mounted on them that someone gave me, and they're not much good for anything else. So that's the main components you need. There's also a bit of other test gear here. Power supply, signal generator, frequency counter. That's a TV pattern generator as well, which we don't really need for this. And a set-top box, which again, that's more for testing analog television sets and the like. But if we set all this up with everything on the shelves and all the cables wired in, it makes it much simpler. We can just set the system up as we want it. So a normal hi-fi system, you've basically got your source, your signal source, which can be a turntable, CD player, cassette player, etc. So that's something you're going to be testing a lot of normally. So we basically will have, if you're repairing that, you've got line level outputs, so you're going to need an amplifier and speakers obviously to listen to it. So that's why we have an amp and speakers up on the shelf there. Also, if you're going to test an amplifier, you're going to need the speakers, and you're going to need a signal source, so you've got some sound to put in and some speakers to listen to it. And the other thing we might be testing occasionally is just the speakers, so we need a sound source and an amplifier, so we've got something to feed into the speakers. So what we need to do is, in between each of these units here, we actually need to make it so we can break the signal chain here. So if I'm testing an amplifier, I want the outputs of the signal source, and I also want to break in here. So I want to put a separate amp in here. It'll have the source in, amp to test. So we want our signal source to be easy to plug into our amp, obviously just normal RCA sockets are the standard. And we also want to be able to plug our amplifier up to these two speakers so that we can test it. If we've just got some sort of cassette player or whatever, obviously as I said, we just want to plug that using its RCA sockets. We want an easy way to plug that into a set of amp and speakers, which we have on the shelf here. And the same with the break we've got here. So we've got inputs there. We can break between our CD player up there and our amplifier and just plug in whatever we want. We can get the output of our CD player, plug it into an amplifier, and also plug in our speakers. And likewise, if we have our source plugged into our amp, we've got a sound source, so we can break into the speaker connections off that amp, disconnect the speakers on the shelf up there, and we can just plug in any old set of speakers we want to test out. So that's basically what these, I've already had these plates set up before, but they're on a different bench. But to make this all nice and easy, you can set up a couple of plates here. That's got speaker and amplifier on it. That's just four RCA sockets and just a very short lead, so we can bridge them out. And we've also got another plate here that's got phono auxiliary on it. So all that is on the back of this. Just got the earth joint on each channel, a couple of what do you call them, shielded audio cable, just the normal stuff. You could actually just use commercial leads and cut the RCA plugs off one end, solder them onto a couple of sockets there. You might even be able to get sockets to mount on these plates that have an RCA each side. I'm not sure what they have available these days, but you can get pre-made plates. These were just blank clipsal plates that I've drilled out, because that's all you could get way back in the old days, in the 80s and 90s and early 90s, before they made commercial ones. So that's just a set of shielded audio cables there that go from those sockets, and they just plug up in the back of this amplifier here. So on the back here, can't really see them that well there, but further along there are some RCA inputs. So that plate just goes straight up those leads and into the amplifier, one for phono, because occasionally you want to test a turntable, and that's a different level, that's low level signal. And the other one just goes, I think, into the tuner or auxiliary, whatever your amp has, any other line level input, which are obviously selected on these front switches. And that's just so we can plug either a record player, turntable into the phono inputs, and any other standard line level audio device straight into auxiliary there. And then on this amplifier we just select the input we want. Now the CD player, I could have put another set of sockets on one of these plates for the CD player output, but I haven't bothered. I've basically just run a longer cable down. That's actually plugged into the input of the amp here at the moment. So that was actually an AV lead originally, I think off a PlayStation or something. It was quite a long one, so I just stripped the video lead off, and I've just run that from the back of the CD player sockets straight down the back of the shelves to here. You could put separate sockets here so you can unplug that lead and get rid of it, but I can just flick it under the shelf here, so it's not a big problem. With the speakers here, you can see a bunch of wires. 2 of those come in from the amplifier and go to this 2 sockets labelled amp, so that's amplifier out. If I want to test speakers, I just plug them straight into those 2. As long as the amp and CD player are hooked together, we'll get sound out of there. If I'm testing an amplifier, then we've got 2 sockets here labelled speaker, and those wires I've actually put a couple of 1 amp fuses on there. Just quick blow 1 amp little fuses, just in case any DC gets up there. I don't want to blow the speakers, so it doesn't hurt to put a couple there. There's one under this bit of heat shrink just so they can't short together, but you can just solder a fuse on there. If you're going to blow them up on a regular basis, which you shouldn't if you check the amps properly, you could actually put a couple of panel mount fuse holders on this plate as well, just to make them easy to change. But it should be, if you're checking your amp properly, it should be rare that you ever blow one of those fuses, but that will protect the speakers normally from getting blown, because it can happen. You can be running an amp or something and something dies, and suddenly you get DC output there. These I've kept all the separate on these, because I used to repair car audio, and yeah, the old car cassette players, CD players, some of them, because of the amplifiers in them these days, I've actually got floating sort of DC outputs on them to get a higher volume out of them, and they don't like the earths being shorted together from channel to channel, so it's best to keep them all separate. But if you just do a normal home hi-fi, you could even probably wire all those earths together without any problem, both the inputs, the outputs, all of them. But it's probably better to keep them, at least the input and the out of the amp and the input of the speakers, separate. I've got this is a lead I pinched off some old cassette player or something. It's just a nice short RCA to RCA lead, and I can just use that if I want to listen to the amplifier here. If I'm testing a tape player or something, then what I can do is just plug that short lead in from the amp outputs to the speaker inputs, and that'll run. So at the moment I've got this CD plugged into the auxiliary input, so if I turn our amplifier on and hit power, then we should get some music coming out of this system. There we go. So the good thing about this Sony CD player is if I turn it off in play mode and then turn the power back on, it just automatically goes back into play again, which is handy. So it might make a lot of me because I was in pause, but no, there it goes. So you can just do that. Look, so we've got this has got magnetic and crystal inputs for the phono, but I've got phono, or I've got tuner input I've used. The tuner input goes back to this auxiliary on the plate. Obviously the phono just goes to the phono, and we've set it up like that. So at the moment I basically have the CD player output comes down these leads. If I need a signal to test an amplifier or to test a record on a cassette player, I can just unplug these leads here, and that'll give me my CD player output. That can plug into an amplifier or record or anything like that. But at the moment I've got that plug, so that's going back into this little peak amplifier, and because I've got our little link cable here, the peak is also connected to the speakers. So we've basically got, you know, the source straight into the amp and into the speakers. That's all on my test bench, but I can, like I say, break into any of these points, and I can just unplug the source from my amp and plug it into any external amp I want to test. And also I can pull that little link cable out, so I disconnect my amplifier, and I can either use the sockets to drive a set of any speakers I want to test other than my ones. They're the ones on the shelves here, so I can hook it up another pair of speakers out of those amp out sockets. Or if I want to break in, I can disconnect my amp so that I go to the speakers that I've got on the shelf here, and any test amp I've got here, just plug it straight in. For the amplifier testing, what you want to make up is a couple of leads with RCA one end, so we plug into our sockets, right ones that help, but we can plug in a speaker socket with RCA, and I've made a couple up with just banana plugs on them, so if you've got an amp with a binding post with banana plugs, you can just plug straight into that, and nice and easy. Also, if you've got speakers, I can go from the speaker output on that plate over there, plug that into the amp output, and if I've got a speaker with banana connections, again I can plug the amp output into the speaker that way. And the only other type of lead you'll need generally for amplifier work, I mean obviously if you're going to work with some of the shelf systems, that they sometimes have different plugs, but for most amps they're either binding posts or just either the spring terminals or the binding posts and banana plugs. So if you've got banana plugs on one lead, for all the spring terminals and other binding posts, we just have an RCA plug one end on a bit of figure 8 cable. Metal ones are the best if you can buy some of those because they last a lot longer. Some of these plastic ones like on the other lead don't last as well, and the other end of the wires are just stripped. I don't normally bother. I have tried soldering these, just tinning them, but they tend to last less time because they're solid and they actually break quicker. So you basically just strip these off. They can just go into any set of terminals on the back of the amp, under the binding post or into those spring terminals. Same with if you're testing speakers, you plug this instead into the amp output, and these will go into those spring terminals on the back of your speaker. Occasionally these will wear out. You just have to cut the two off and strip new bits of plastic off the wire, and that's fine. So they're a simple lead. So you make a pair of them, one for each channel, and a pair with banana plugs, and that's all you normally need. There were, you know, back in the day with some of the old stereos, you would end up with things like 3.5 RCA to 3.5mm plugs, or those old 2-pin DIN plugs I used to use. I think I've still got some leads somewhere with 2-pin to RCA, probably in my drawer of leads somewhere. But for most modern gear, yeah, the banana plugs, they're just more convenient because they're quicker, because the banana plug ones don't have the spring terminals. They got the binding posts you have to rotate and then stick the wires under, so it's obviously quicker if you can just plug straight into them. But with the spring terminals, just use these. If you've got a car radio, you can just put a couple of clip leads on these or twist the wires onto the back of the stereo wiring harness. You just got to be a lot more careful that they don't start moving together and short out or anything while you're running them. Either put tape around them or just keep a good eye on them, make sure they don't move. But you can basically hook up pretty much all modern equipment with that, both speakers or amplifiers. So it's basically just a matter of hooking up a couple of sockets, and we can just plug in any sort of leads we need. RCA leads to go to a record player, or the leads off the record player can go straight in. Ideally you'd probably have an earth on here as well, but for test purposes you're not really worried if there's a little bit of hum out of the turntable. And when these are not in use, you can basically unplug any leads, and you don't have leads all over your bench. I can unplug these if I've been testing an amplifier, and I just hang them up on a screw on the side here with a few clip leads and stuff, and they're all out of the way, so that's nice and neat. If you've got a couple of short leads like that, you can pretty much leave them there, poke the rest under the bench. Obviously I'll screw these plates back onto this bit of wood here, and everything will be neat and tidy. It's, you know, hardly any work at all just to plug something in. You just got to find an RCA lead if you need it, or grab one of these speaker leads or something, and bingo, you're in, plug it into power, and you've got the system set up. You can use, you know, instead of a CD player, you could use any sort of signal source really, but you want something that you can be sure is putting out a signal. You could use an old FM tuner or something, but then there's always the risk that it'll get knocked off station or something, and you're wondering why you've got no signal, and it's just that the tuner's not working. But again, you can always plug it into your test amp just to make sure it's going. But any audio source will do there, as long as it's got a line level output. And you really want just an older amplifier that's got a phono input if you're going to be doing anything with turntables. A lot of people probably won't. The other thing I've got here is a couple of dummy loads if I need them. You could set them up permanently. If you're going to test an amp for a long time on soak test after you've repaired the outputs or something, you'd want these sitting on a bit of metal, or where the terminals can't short out obviously, but you want them somewhere. Ideally you can actually stick a metal rod through a couple of these and hang them somewhere, just so if I left them on the carpet on the bench here, they'd end up cooking the carpet probably, certainly make a horrible smell. So you want those somewhere hanging up in the air where they can run reasonably cool, just with a steel bar through them or something, or put them in a metal box or whatever. But I don't really use them enough to bother. I never really have used them enough to put them in a proper case. They're another useful thing to have just for test running amps. Got a bench power supply, which for audio gear you probably won't need much, but for general testing and stuff it's handy. Occasionally you'll want to test a cassette player motor or something, pull it out of the unit, put 12 volts into it and just make sure it's running right. Pretty rare, but occasionally you want something like that, or test a light globe or something, so it's handy to have a separate bench for that, bench power supply for that. I've got a signal generator there. I don't use that all that often, but if you're testing an amp that's got distortion or something, you want a nice clean sine wave generator, you could use an audio test cassette or something if you've got that puts out 1 kilohertz. These days you could probably play something off YouTube or something and get a 1 kilohertz signal that way. But it's always handy to have a nice source of variable in frequency and amplitude, but most of the time you'll just be putting like a line level 1 kilohertz signal in, so it doesn't need to be anything fancy. You could even build a little tiny oscillator out of a few transistors or something and that'd do the job. And a frequency counter, that's handy if you're testing the speed. You want to measure the speed of a cassette player motor, you can just run your 1 kilohertz test tape in there and check it on that. But again, it's pretty rare I ever used any of these things, but just the odd job you'll need them. I mean, I've got the old oscilloscope sitting over here as well. Occasionally I use that, but again, it hasn't had a lot of use over the years, so I actually used it probably more on video recorders and TVs, tracking problems with video signals and stuff, not so much on the audio. This is a big old analog Crow, so it takes up quite a bit of room. That's why I haven't got it on these little shelves. I used to have it on a deeper shelf. But it'd be worth, you can pop for $500 these days. You can buy a nice little digital Crow that doesn't stick back far and would fit on some little shallow shelves like this quite easily. I've just got the soldering iron off to one side. Couple of power points on the front of the bench here. Makes it a lot easier. Get these little thin circuit board mounting ones and put a bit of timber on the front of the bench. And you've got power points at the front. I always like to work with power points on the front of the bench because I'm not leaning over the equipment. If something goes wrong or whatever, I can just flick it off to the side of me. And for safety reasons, you can see that what you've got on, what you've got plugged in and what's on if it's at the front here. So it's always better because you're going to be working on the equipment up on here. You got it plugged in down here, and these actually got neons on them, which is even better. You can see what's on. But I always find it safer to be able to have it in the front here. I can always just look to the side of me and go, whoops, have I got that on or haven't I got it on? These days with earth leakage breakers too, if you're working on stuff, you have to pull the plug out of the unit, because if you touch anything on the neutral side, that'll actually trip the earth leakage normally, which is a pain. You've got to go back to the switchboard and reset that. So front power points, if you can do it, is always handy. Obviously you don't have to have them permanently fixed to the bench. You could come up with something else, just a four-way power board or something, but always pays to make them easy to access and easy just to check, because if you're working on something you think, geez, did I turn the power off? You can just look to the side of you and tell straight away. And like I say, if something starts exploding on you or cooking on you, some electronics burning up and the smoke coming out of it, you can sort of switch it off straight away without, you don't want to be leaning over the unit to get to the back here somewhere and turn off a power point, because that's the last thing you want to do if it's starting to spark or something. You don't want your face or anything near it, so if the power point's here, you can just automatically flick it off, and it becomes a habit. You know where it is, and you always just tend to reach as soon as you want to do some work on the unit. You know where the switch is and just flick it off. And like I say, if you're going to be touching anything with the main circuitry with a soldering iron or your hands or anything, you've really got to unplug it fully these days, or you'll trip the earth leakage. Just there's enough voltage difference between the neutral and the earth to flick those things off. But I think that's the main sort of stuff. You can just hang a few tools on the side or whatever, even though I'm not really using shifters for fixing audio gear, but it's just a handy place to have them. Like I say, your multimeter handy, your soldering iron handy. There's a bit of methylated spirits in there, just one of these little things. You press it a few times and it comes out the top, save it evaporating, and a few cotton buds and stuff so you can clean things. And that's about the main sort of stuff you need most of the time. I've just got a mess of tools over the other side here. You can get a little tray or something. I used to have a tray to put them in, or even a toolbox or something, but I've sort of just got a mess here at the moment. But as long as you keep a sort of area clear, just so you've got a nice area to work. That's where my solder's gone. Usually the solder's over here next to the soldering iron as well, so you can always find your solder and your soldering irons ready to go. The only other thing with these front mounted power points that reminds me, you just got to be careful if you're messing around with solder and stuff, it doesn't fall down onto the power point. It can potentially get between the power point and the plug and short out, or give you a shock or something. So best to be a bit careful with your solder, because you've just got this bare metal floating around the bench. So it's always something to keep an eye on. You don't want that getting under a unit you're working on or anywhere near power points. But if you've got an earth leakage breaker, which you should have these days, there's no excuse, because they're so cheap to buy now, to have some sort of earth leakage protection in case you touch something, especially audio gear. There's often transformers, switches and stuff that are just no insulation on the terminals, so it's easy when you're working on a tape deck or something to have your hands messing around with the mechanism, and next minute your finger's sort of gone back a bit and touched something with 240 volts on it. Even though you should have it turned off, you don't always, because you're trying to check something out while the unit's running. So always best to have earth leakage protection for your bench. You'll probably only ever trigger it by accident, by, like I say, touching the neutral or something, but at least it's there should you ever get in a dangerous situation. But that's basically my bench. In case the other thing, obviously you want some good lighting. I've just got a couple of downlights. This is just on an old metal frame, this bench, but I'll put a bit of timber around it. Bit of timber on the top here with a couple of downlights I can switch on and off right here, because occasionally you might want it a bit dimmer to see something that's it's more with TV sets and stuff, if you want to see if the picture tube's got a filament or something. But it's nice to have a light switch sort of built in locally, easy enough to do, and just have enough power boards and stuff behind all your equipment, so there's no cables hanging out everywhere. Everything's switched on and plugged in, ready to go. Ideally, you also have it so the whole bench is hooked up via a plug into a power point or something, so you can just turn the whole thing off when you're finished. That way your soldering iron and stuff like that, and there's no risk of that being left on and starting a fire or something. Just when you're finished with using your bench and doing whatever you're doing on it, you just turn it off, everything, all your test equipment goes off, your soldering iron goes off, and everything's safe then. So that's always another handy feature to have. You could even have, like, if you've got an earth leakage PowerPoint type setup, you can just press the test button on that and just flick everything off, and then you just press the reset button when you want to use the bench again. So I think that's about it for this one. Thanks for watching.